Lady Constance Ashburn placed the folded special license on the writing desk and said, perfectly calm, that Evangeline would be married to the stable boy before the clock struck 6. The words did not register. They could not. Evangeline's eyes caught on the parchment, on the cramped legal script, on the wax seal already broken, on her own name, written in a clerk's hand beside another name she did not recognize. The morning light through the drawing-room window fell across the desk in a long, yellow bar, and inside that bar, the paper lay as innocent as a receipt from a milliner. "I do not understand," Evangeline said. "I think you understand perfectly." Her stepmother was smiling. The smile did not move above her cheekbones. "Lord Moresby made me a gracious offer. You refused him. You made a scene at the Pulteney ballroom and have, apparently, developed a talent for humiliating this family. I have spared you the necessity of refusing again." "By—" Evangeline's throat closed. She forced it open. "By marrying me to a servant. By marrying you to someone who will never again cost me an invitation." Lady Constance tapped one finger against the license, light as a pianist, striking a single note. "His name is on the paper. I had the clerk write it in for you. The village priest will arrive at the chapel at 5:30. You will be dressed. You will be punctual. You will, at last, be useful." Evangeline stood very still. She had learned the trick of stillness at 13, the first winter after her father's death, the first time Lady Constance had struck her across the mouth for correcting her French. Stillness had been the only currency she had. She spent it now like a woman counting out the last of her coins. "I will refuse." "You may refuse." Her stepmother rose from the chair and crossed to the bell pull. She did not ring it yet. "Refuse, and Mrs. Parry will be in Fleet Prison before Sunday morning." The room did not change, but Evangeline felt the floor tilt beneath her slippers. She reached one hand out, almost to the edge of the desk, and did not let the hand actually touch the wood. Stillness. Stillness was all she had. "Mrs. Parry is 68 years old." "Yes." Lady Constance allowed her fingers to rest on the bell-pull's silk. "And her son was an unfortunate creditor of this family, and the debt, which I have been so very patient about, has come due. I have the papers in the top drawer of that desk. They are already signed by the magistrate. It wants only my name beneath his." "You cannot." "I can. I can sign them and send them to Reading by the 4 o'clock post, and Mrs. Parry will be arrested in her kitchen tomorrow. Or—" Lady Constance smiled again, with only her mouth. "You can dress and come to the chapel at the appointed hour, and allow this household to finally return to the respectability it has been denied since your father so inconveniently passed." Evangeline did not look at the license on the desk. She looked at the little carved rosewood clock on the mantel, which her father had wound every Sunday morning of her childhood, and which had marked the hours of every misery of the last 10 years, without noticing one of them. "Who is he?" she asked. "Who is whom?" "The man on the paper." "Oh, Luke Smith. He has been in our stables for 2 months. I'm told he is competent. I'm told very little else." Lady Constance flicked the license closed. "He has already agreed." "You purchased him?" "I paid him £10 and a recommendation to a London household. He was grateful. Servants so rarely are. I found it refreshing." Evangeline allowed herself, at last, to place her palm flat against the desk. She could feel the grain of the wood through the cold of her skin. She counted. Not from 1, she had given up on 1, but from 5, backward, as her old music master had taught her to do before a difficult passage. 5, 4, 3, 2. "I will dress," she said. "I knew you would. You have always been practical, when pushed." Lady Constance moved toward the door. "Harriet will be your witness. The priest is my cousin's and discreet. We will confine the news to household records. I have no interest in making a public matter of it. Not yet. I will consider what to announce after the ceremony. After. Her stepmother paused at the door. And Evangeline, should you, at any point in the next 4 hours, believe that refusal would be interesting, remember that Mrs. Parry made your porridge this morning. She is a small woman. Fleet is not kind to small women. The door closed with a soft click that sounded, in Evangeline's skull, like a musket's hammer pulled back. She did not weep. She did not sit. She walked, instead, to the window, and pressed her forehead against the cold glass, and looked out across the April garden, the box hedges just breaking into new green, the first hawthorn in bud against the south wall, a thrush fussing somewhere in the yew walk beyond the sundial. And she tried, for exactly 7 breaths, to find one single thing in the visible world that Lady Constance did not yet own. She could not. Beyond the window, the gardener's boy was wheeling a barrow of cut turf along the gravel, whistling an Irish tune off-key. A wood pigeon on the roof of the dovecote called twice, paused, called again. The light was the particular honeyed yellow of early spring, thin, clean, ungenerous, and it lay across the lawn in the long, exact bar that a servant's hand had drawn, year after year, between the shutters of a house that once had been her father's. Evangeline held her breath. The taste at the back of her mouth was metallic, faintly sweet. She had tasted it every morning for 8 months in her tea, and had been told by her stepmother that it was the character of the Ashburn well. She understood now, with the small, sickening precision of an arithmetic problem solved too late, that the well had been innocent. The window was cold, the glass was uneven, an old, wavy pane full of bubbles, and through it the garden rippled slightly, as if seen through water. She could feel a draught along the sill, the edge of April still clinging to the stone. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed the half-hour. Another clock, further off, followed 3 seconds behind. They had been out of time since she was 12, and she had never before noticed that the staff had stopped correcting them. The stables. She would be married in the stables. She closed her eyes. She counted the draught against her cheek. She counted the thrush. She counted, under her breath, from 5 backward to 1, and then from 5 backward to 1 again. And when she opened her eyes, the quality of the light in the bar across the writing desk had not altered, and neither had the license, and neither, Evangeline discovered, had she. She walked to the chapel at 5:20 through the gravel court that ran along the south side of the stable yard, because it was the shortest way, and she had promised herself she would not stretch the hour. The sun was still above the elms. Its light fell in long, slanted planes across the gravel, warm where it reached her shoulders, cold at her hands. She carried no gloves. She had not been able to find gloves, her stepmother having removed her dressing room keys that morning. And her fingers were white at the knuckles where they held the little pasteboard prayer book that Harriet had pressed into her hand at the foot of the stairs without saying a word. The wind came up from the south. It smelled of wet earth and hawthorn, and, when she passed the stable door, of hay and warm horse, and the particular sweet, sour warmth of a yard that had been worked in since dawn. A crow clapped out of the elms and beat low across the garden toward the orchard. A bucket clanked somewhere inside the stable. The gravel crunched small and clean beneath her slippers, thin leather slippers, unsuited to gravel, which her stepmother had laid out for her with the particular cruelty of attention to detail. The stable door stood open. She did not mean to look inside. She looked. A man in shirt sleeves was rubbing down a grey mare with a twist of straw. He had his back to the yard. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. His forearms were brown from the weather and threaded with the quiet muscle of someone who did not perform his strength for company. The mare was Steadfast, Evangeline's own mare, supposedly sold last October to a dealer in Newbury, supposedly gone. Evangeline stopped in the doorway before she had decided to stop. The man straightened. He turned. He was younger than she had expected, and taller. His dark hair was damp at the temples. He had been at work for a long time. He had a strong jaw, clean-shaven, and a mouth set in a line that was neither sullen nor eager. His eyes, when they found her, were the color of weather, a slow, grave, iron grey, and they registered her without surprise. Miss Ashburn. His voice was low. It had, at the edges, the flat vowels of a West Country lad. Under that, something else, something she could not place. She could not answer. She looked at him, and at Steadfast, and at the mare's soft nose pressed against the man's shoulder as if the two of them had a standing arrangement. She thought, absurdly, she lied about the mare, too. "I will see you in the chapel," the man said, and he returned to his work. She walked the rest of the way without feeling the gravel beneath her feet. The sound of her own heartbeat, high, light, uneven, took the place of the gravel in her hearing. The hawthorn by the chapel door was already in bloom, a small explosion of cream against the dark yew behind it, and the scent of it, meadowsweet, almond-edged, obscurely nuptial, met her at the porch. She stood for a moment in the porch, with her hand on the iron ring of the chapel door, and looked back across the yard. The stable door was closed again. The shaft of late sun lay unbroken across the gravel where no man, apparently, stood. She pushed the chapel door open. The hinges complained. The sound of the hinges, for some reason, was the sound that steadied her. The chapel was the old one, the stone Norman chapel at the edge of the home park, whose roof her father had re-leaded the year before he was taken, whose brass her mother had polished every Easter of her married life. The priest was an elderly man with a stammer, borrowed from a parish 3 counties away. Harriet Ashburn, Lady Constance's cousin, 22 and chinless and adoring, stood in the front pew already, holding a prayer book upside down. Evangeline entered in the lavender muslin she had worn to her mother's funeral. She had not been permitted to change it. The license was on the altar. Her stepmother was on the left-hand side of the aisle, seated, smiling. There were 3 candles. There were no flowers. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, and coughed, and began again. The man, Luke Smith, the stable hand, her husband, in 7 minutes, came through the side door in a plain, dark coat that did not quite fit across the shoulders. He had washed his hands and combed his hair flat. He did not look at Lady Constance. He looked at Evangeline, briefly, and then at the priest, and then at the stone floor in front of him. Evangeline stood beside him at the altar rail. She could smell clean linen and saddle soap, and very faintly, the meadowsweet that grew wild in the stable yard drain. His hand, when the priest asked for it, was calloused across the palm and along the ridge of the thumb. It was warm. It did not tremble. Hers did, and he closed his fingers around hers firmly enough to still them. "I, Luke Smith. I, Evangeline Mary. To have and to hold. From this day forward." Lady Constance laughed, once, quietly, as the priest fumbled the ring. It was not Evangeline's mother's ring. It was a thin band of plain gold Harriet had been sent to purchase that afternoon from the village silversmith. Luke slid it onto Evangeline's finger. His gaze touched hers, flat and dark and utterly composed, and then dropped again to the stone. "You may," the priest began. "No," said Lady Constance pleasantly. "That will not be necessary." Luke did not move. Evangeline did not move. The priest mumbled the rest in a single breath and signed the register with a hand that shook more than Evangeline's had. It was done. "The cottage," said Lady Constance, rising. "By tradition. Harriet, walk our bride as far as the yard. Mr. Smith knows the way." The groom's cottage was a single stone room at the southwest corner of the stable yard, whose thatch sagged, whose chimney was crooked, whose door had sprung at the hinges sometime during the last rain. A tallow candle burned on the chest, throwing a small circle of buttery light across the flags, and casting long, leaning shadows up the whitewashed walls. A narrow iron bed was pushed against the far wall beneath the only window, and on the bed, someone, Harriet probably, smirking, had turned down the coverlet and laid a sprig of hawthorn across the pillow. The sprig was still fresh. 2 white petals had fallen onto the linen. The air smelled of cold stone and old smoke, and faintly of the horse harness oil that had been kept in the cottage for the last 10 years. A single joint of ham hung from a hook in the ceiling, wrapped in muslin, forgotten. The floor had been swept, but only recently, and in the far corner, a small damp patch on the flags marked where a kitchen maid had been hurried over her work. The single window was narrow, set low, and admitted the last blue of the April evening in a thin band across the foot of the bed. Evangeline entered first. Luke closed the door behind them. He did not lock it. He did not look at the bed. Evangeline turned to face him. She had been practicing the sentence for the last hour in her head. "I will not sit." His voice was not low now. It was not country flat. It was the voice of a man who had given orders to other men and watched them obey. She blinked. She did not, for a moment, understand what language the word belonged to. "Sit, Evangeline. On the edge of the bed, please. I need to look at you." She sat, because the command was given with too much precision to refuse. He did not sit beside her. He knelt. He took her left hand, the one with the cheap new ring on it, and rolled the wedding dress sleeve back to her elbow. His fingers found the pulse at her wrist. His thumb pressed, lightly, against the inside of her forearm, checking the color of the vein. "Your pulse is too slow," he said. "Your pupils are dilated. You have a tremor at the thumb. Have you been sleeping?" "What?" "Have you been sleeping, Evangeline?" "No, badly, for months." "Since you returned from Bath?" It was not a question. She stared at him. Look at me." He did not raise his eyes. He was still watching the pulse in her wrist. "Your stepmother has been putting foxglove in your tea. A small dose, not enough to end you. Enough to keep your heart slow and your head foggy and your will pliable. I began swapping the tin in small increments a fortnight ago, and in full this morning. You have been drinking chamomile and chamomile alone since the small hours of today. In 72 hours, you will be entirely clear." She tried to draw her hand back. He let her. "Who are you?" He rose to his full height at last. The stoop of the stable lad was gone from his shoulders. She had not seen this before, because she had not been permitted to see him at all, nearly half a foot taller than she was. He stepped back from the bed to give her space. He clasped his hands behind him at parade rest. The plain, dark coat that did not quite fit him was suddenly the only uniform that made sense. "My name is Lucas Edmund Winterbourne," he said. "I was christened at the cathedral at Salisbury on the 11th of October, 1796. My father was the 9th Duke of Winterbourne. He was taken 4 years ago. I am the 10th. Her hand fell into her lap. The candle guttered. A thin gust of wind found its way under the sprung door and moved the flame sideways. The room's shadows leaned and righted themselves against the whitewashed wall. Somewhere in the stable yard, a horse shifted its weight against a wooden partition. The cottage chimney, cold and unused, exhaled a quiet breath of soot that fell, almost imperceptibly, onto the stones of the hearth. "Your Grace," he said, quietly, looking at her. "I apologize for marrying you in a false name. We can correct the register when you are well enough to stand, and to answer questions about whom, precisely, you consented to marry. I will not touch you tonight. I will not touch you any night you have not asked me to. But you are, as of a quarter of an hour ago, the Duchess of Winterbourne, and I thought you ought to know before your stepmother's next dose of tea arrives in the morning." Evangeline could not speak. Every thought she had ever had about her own future collapsed inward, quietly, like a house folding into its own chimney. She had known, within the last hour, that she would be a stable boy's wife. She had known, within the last 30 seconds, that she would not. In between, her life had rearranged its furniture, and now she sat in the middle of an altered room with no idea which wall had moved. Outside, the mare, steadfast, not sold to Newbury after all, wickered softly against the stable wall, as if she too had been part of this for longer than anyone had told her. The April evening had cooled. The last blue band across the foot of the bed had deepened to an ink-dark indigo. The candle's flame steadied. The small room held its breath. He did not move from where he stood. He waited. He had the patience of a man accustomed to standing in cold rooms for reasons other men did not understand. "You are mad," Evangeline said, finally, because it was the only sentence her mouth could manage. "I have been called worse by more competent persons." He reached inside his coat and withdrew a folded paper, which he laid on the lid of the chest where the tallow candle guttered. "My commission as the 10th Duke, signed and sealed. You may read it in whatever light you prefer. I would offer you better light, but the cottage has none, and the candle is mine." "If you are—" Her voice caught. She cleared it. "If you are a duke, Mr. Winterbourne, what in the name of every saint are you doing in my stepmother's stables, rubbing down my mare?" "Your mare." Something warmed briefly at the corner of his mouth, and was gone. "I wondered when you would notice." "Answer me." "Blackmail," he said. The word dropped between them like a stone into a well. "Your stepmother has in her possession a letter." He spoke quickly now, without decoration, like a man reporting to a superior officer. "A forged letter, written on genuine Winterbourne paper, in a reasonable imitation of my father's hand. It claims that he fathered an illegitimate child with your stepmother's late sister, Felicia. It is an elaborate lie. My father was at Malta the month the child was supposedly conceived, and the Admiralty can prove it. But your stepmother has been threatening my mother with its publication for 9 months. She has demanded £30,000, payable in 3 installments, with a letter of credit on the firm of Coots in November." "My 30,000? "The first installment is due the 1st of June. My mother is 63 and ill with a weak heart. If that letter were printed in the London papers, she would be in her grave by Michaelmas. I know this. Your stepmother knows this. She has built the entire extortion on that certainty." Evangeline placed one hand flat against the counterpane. She looked at the crooked chimney. She looked at the paper on the chest. She did not look at him. "And you came here," she said, "to steal the letter?" "To find it, yes, and to identify whoever helped her forge it. There was a clerk in my father's London household who disappeared last summer. I believe he wrote it, and I believe he is long since in the ground. I've been working as a stable hand for 64 days. I've searched 32 rooms of this house under various pretenses. I have not yet found the original. I suspect it is kept on her person." "Why did you not simply have her arrested?" "On the accusation of a dowager duchess who cannot testify without confirming the lie exists. Your stepmother is not a clever woman, Evangeline, but she has been extraordinarily careful about that one letter. My magistrate in Reading requires the original to act." "So you waited?" "So I waited." He did not look away. "And then I saw you." She looked at him at last. "I came back from Bath in February," he said. "You came back from Bath in February. You walked across the courtyard on the afternoon of the 14th, wearing a grey pelisse and carrying a music folder, and a kitchen maid met you at the door with a cup of tea, and I watched you drink it. I watched you again 2 hours later. The pallor, the tremor, the slowness of the pupils. I knew the signs. My father's second wife had an aunt who was poisoned by a cook in 1814 by this exact method. The cook hanged for it. I went to the kitchen that evening and tasted the tin. I tasted the chamomile. I tasted the other tin, marked the same, in a different cupboard. I have been swapping them since." Her mouth was dry. "Why?" "Why what?" "Why swap the tins? Why keep me alive? You did not know me." He held her gaze. "Because no one deserves to be poisoned by increments in a house that was once her father's," he said. "And because, Evangeline, I did not know you, and then I watched you across a courtyard for a fortnight, and after that it would have been inconvenient to stand by and watch you die." He said it as a man reported weather. No softening, no apology. She found she could not look away. "The marriage," she said. "Explain it." "She meant to cheapen your name, hers too, but she would pay that cost to ruin you. She meant to isolate you legally. Once you had married a servant, any claim you might have made on the Ashburn estate as your father's daughter would dissolve. Once you were in this cottage, she could poison you openly, and the household would assume the grief of an unequal match. I could not stop her announcing the match. She had the license by noon yesterday. But I could volunteer. For £10 and a character recommendation. For my name on that license." He nodded once at the paper. "I am, as of 5:30 this afternoon, your lawful husband in the record of every assize in the kingdom. I am lawfully on these premises. I am lawfully responsible for your safety. I have lawful cause to seize any document that endangers my wife. And at 5:30 tomorrow, I will cease to be Luke Smith, stable hand, and begin to be the Duke of Winterbourne, in whose name your stepmother will be in a cell by Whitsun, if you will help me." Evangeline drew a long breath and let it out slowly. "If I will help you. If you will trust me," he said. "I took your name this afternoon without warning you. I will not do it a second time. From this hour forward, Evangeline, you know everything I know when I know it. I promise that. I do not promise gently. I promise plainly. Will you agree?" She did not answer immediately. She looked at the candle. She looked at the paper on the chest, which lay there with its wax seal half in shadow, the Winterbourne coat of arms pressed into the red wax in a fine, precise relief. A stag, a mullet of 6 points, the motto she could not quite read at this distance. She looked at the man who had been a stable lad that morning, and was now, somehow, a peer of the realm, standing in a crooked cottage at the edge of her stepmother's yard, waiting for her verdict. She looked at the calloused ridge across his thumb, and at the set of his jaw, and at the way he held himself at parade rest with his hands behind his back. The way a commanding officer holds himself when he has finished his report and is awaiting the verdict of his court-martial, knowing that the facts are on his side, and that facts are not, as a rule, persuasive against a hostile room. The room was not hostile. The room was only very quiet. The little fire she had not yet noticed, banked in the hearth, shifted and settled in a handful of orange embers. She began to ask her questions in the plain, flat order she had been taught to ask them as a girl, one at a time, each a single word. The mare, her nurse, the tea. He answered each in kind. Steadfast was hers. He had paid £2 for the mare in December, and kept her at a farm outside Reading while he established himself at the house. Her stepmother, Lucas observed, did not recognize horses so much as the prices they fetched. Mrs. Harry was alive, and not yet in the hands of any magistrate. He had not known of the fleet threat until her stepmother had made it aloud through the drawing-room window that afternoon, a window past which he had been walking every hour since breakfast. And he would have the old woman out of the house by tomorrow night, safely conducted by a man in Reading whom he trusted with harder errands than this one. The morning's tea was safe. He had switched the tin at breakfast when the kitchen maid took down the urn. As for his own sleeping arrangements, he gave them plainly. On the floor, on my coat, beside the door. You will lock the door behind you in the morning when you walk back to the house. You will behave, tomorrow, and for as many days as are necessary, like a woman who has been beaten into a mésalliance and is walking through her own disgrace. That is the part you must play. I cannot act it for you. Can you? Evangeline looked at him, at the plain dark coat that did not fit, at the calloused thumb, at the grey, steady eyes, and she thought of every lesson she had taken in the last 10 years in the currency of stillness. I can act it, she said. Something in his shoulders eased by an inch. Then tomorrow, Your Grace, he said. We begin. She laughed then, a single, startled laugh. the first laugh she had produced since her stepmother had placed the license on the desk. Because nothing about the day was funny, and everything about the last hour was absurd. And the absurdity was, at last, on her side. "Do not call me that," she said. "Not yet. It is not a title I have earned." "You will earn it by Tuesday fortnight," he said. "I have watched you count your breaths when you were afraid. I have watched you keep your hand from trembling on the altar rail. You will wear Winterbourne as if it had waited for you. The question is whether Winterbourne will be worthy of you. And on that point, my reservations are exclusively about the Duke." She looked at him. The candle flickered. "Good night, Mr. Winterbourne." "Good night, Miss Ashburn." And he lay down, without further ceremony, on the stone floor beside the door, with his coat rolled beneath his head, one hand resting lightly on the hilt of a blade she had not seen him carry. She did not sleep until after the dawn chorus. When she did sleep, it was a sleep without dreams, the first such sleep in 2 years. In the morning she walked back to the main house alone, as instructed, and composed her face into the expression her stepmother would expect, a white-faced, trembling, shocked young woman who had endured the unendurable and would endure more of it before the week was out. It was not difficult to compose. Much of it was true. The house seemed different in the dawn light, as if some quantity of its hostility had thinned overnight. The front hall, black and white marble, a pair of grim portraits of Ashburn uncles who had fought Marlborough's campaigns, a long mahogany case clock that had kept perfect time under her father's stewardship and gained 11 minutes a day under her stepmother's, received her with its habitual cold. A maid, carrying a coal bucket, passed her on the back stairs, curtsied without meeting her eyes, and hurried on. A footman in the passage wished her good morning and looked at his shoes. The household had begun to understand that something had been altered by the wedding, though no one could quite have said what. Evangeline understood perfectly. Her name was no longer her own. Her identity had been reassigned, without ceremony, to a duke asleep on a cottage floor with a blade under his head. Her stepmother did not yet know this. No one in the house knew this, except a steward with a key in his desk and the elderly ghost of Mrs. Parry who made bread in the kitchen and, Evangeline suspected, had known many things for many years that she had never been asked about. Lady Constance met her in the breakfast parlour with an air of critical satisfaction, the way a housekeeper surveys a freshly scrubbed fireplace. "You are punctual," her stepmother observed. "I had hoped you would be. Harriet, pour your cousin a cup of tea." Harriet, who had been feeding bread to the little terrier under the table, rose to pour. Evangeline accepted the cup. She looked into the pale brown liquid and was entirely certain, in a way she could not have explained, that Lucas, the Duke, her husband, had switched this cup's leaves as well. The certainty was not a thought. It was a pressure at the back of her neck, as if another pair of eyes had steadied themselves there from outside. "I trust," said her stepmother, "that the night passed without incident?" "The night passed. I do not require details. I require the acquiescence of your manner in company. You will take the dog-cart to church on Sunday. You will sit in the family pew. You will acknowledge no one who speaks to you, and you will speak to no one. I will describe the marriage, when the matter becomes public, as a painful necessity. The household will support that story, because the household depends on my goodwill. Am I clear?" "Yes." "Good." Lady Constance returned her attention to the newspaper. "You may go. Your Smith will be kept in the stables. The cottage will, henceforward, be locked during daylight hours. I will consider, in a week or so, whether to discharge him, and where to pack you." Evangeline rose and curtsied. It was the curtsy her governess had taught her at 8, the curtsy of a young lady addressing an elder woman of superior station, correct to the inch, full of the poison of pure manners. Lady Constance, who had never in her life noticed poisoned manners, did not notice these. Evangeline left the breakfast parlour, and, in the passage outside it, allowed herself one breath. One. Then she walked on. She did not see Lucas that morning. She saw Steadfast when she passed the stable yard on her way to post a letter to an aunt in Yorkshire who had not answered her in 3 years and would not answer her now. The mare's nose pressed against her shoulder through the half door, soft and warm and damp at the nostrils. The mare's breath plumed white in the April chill. A single wisp of grey mane caught on Evangeline's lavender sleeve and remained there after she had walked on, a small grey thread against the lavender that she did not at first notice and then refused to remove. Evangeline put her face against the mare's jaw and breathed her in, the smell of warm horse and hay and, distantly, leather soap, and remembered that her father had brought Steadfast home in a snowstorm when Evangeline had been 14, slipping and cursing on the gravel, his face red, his delight ridiculous. He had paid 7 guineas for the mare, and had negotiated that price down from 11 by the simple expedient of making the Newbury horse dealer laugh. Evangeline had been standing in the doorway of the front hall in her nightdress when he arrived, her mother behind her in a red shawl, and her father had tramped across the marble in his wet boots and said, perfectly serious, "I bought you a mare, Eve, and she is neither beautiful nor fast, but she is kind, and if I have taught you anything, it is that kindness in a horse will outwalk speed by 4 miles to 1. She had been 14. He had been 49. He had had, she realized only afterward, a little more than 2 years. "I am glad he kept you," she whispered into the mare's neck. "I am glad one of us still has her." Behind the stable wall, 3 feet from where she stood, a grey-eyed man listened to that whisper, and carefully, deliberately, did not move. They met properly, as conspirators, not as bride and groom, on the 10th afternoon of the marriage, in the library. The library was a long, low-ceilinged room on the north side of the house, with 3 tall sash windows, a green baize carpet, a fire screen embroidered by her grandmother in 1798, and, along every wall to the ceiling, the unbroken spines of a collection that Evangeline's father had accumulated over 20 years with more enthusiasm than discipline. Milton's next to novels, Gibbon beside a broken set of Hume, a 6-volume treatise on Italian drainage, shelved beside the poems of Cowper because, her father had said, both were essentially concerned with wetness. A ladder on brass rails ran the length of the south wall. A globe of the world, its Russian territory slightly flaking, stood in the corner under a bust of a Roman emperor who had, for reasons no one could recall, been labelled Dryden. The room smelled of old leather and cold ashes, and the beeswax her mother had used on the reading table. Lady Constance was at Reading, inspecting a new carriage horse. Harriet was out paying calls. The housekeeper was in the still room. Evangeline, who had been instructed to remain in her bedroom, had instead carried a work basket into the library and sat down at the table nearest the south window, with a half-pretended piece of embroidery. The window looked out over the rose walk, where the hawthorn of 4 days ago had fully unfolded now into untidy cream clouds. The primroses along the gravel had begun their second flush. A thrush, possibly the same thrush, was arguing with a robin in the yew. Evangeline drew 3 stitches of violent blue thread through a handkerchief her stepmother would never admire. At 2:15, Lucas came in by the garden door in his stable-hand's coat, closed it behind him, and dropped into the chair opposite hers without a greeting. He observed that she looked better. Her eyes were focused, he said. Her colour had returned to the right side of the spectrum. He glanced at the embroidery and informed her, evenly, that the stitching was extraordinarily bad. She agreed. It was intended to be extraordinarily bad, she explained. A competent lady's embroidery invited comment. Incompetent embroidery required none, and she had been practicing the incompetent variety for some years. He called her a menace, then corrected himself. She had told him not to call her Duchess in this house, and took the correction with the small, silent amusement of a man who accepted authority only when he liked its source. He leaned back in his chair. He did not lower his voice. No one could hear them. The passage door was closed, the garden door was closed behind him, and Lady Constance's gig would be audible 3 minutes before it reached the gate. He asked her then, to tell him where her stepmother kept her private papers. In her bedchamber, in a walnut cabinet on the left wall with a separate key. The key hangs at her waist on a black ribbon. All of the papers. All the papers she touches frequently. There is a second set, household accounts, the older correspondence, in the steward's office. The steward is a Mr. Grimsby. He is an old man and honest. He will not open the office for you. Will he open it for you? Evangeline considered. He will open it for me tomorrow morning at 7, if I tell him I wish to inspect my father's ledgers. He was my father's man. He has been kept on as a concession. He resents her, quietly, as old men do. Good. You will inspect the ledgers. I will accompany you because the lady of the house has, unfortunately, been instructed to carry her embroidery in the presence of a male servant at all times, a humiliation her stepmother will find delightful, and which will excuse my presence anywhere you happen to walk. Evangeline smiled, without intending to. She looked down at the embroidery to hide the smile. She asked him what they were looking for in the steward's office. The older letters, he said. 9 months ago, Lady Constance had begun the blackmail, and 6 months before that, she'd begun acquiring fresh paper with a Winterbourne watermark, which could not have been bought locally. Someone in London had sold it to her. There would be a receipt, or a draft on her account, or a letter of introduction to a stationer. Her stepmother, Lucas observed, was not a careful woman in the long term, only in the short. And the cabinet in the bedchamber, Evangeline asked. That, he said, was the original of the forgery, and probably also the ledger of her other affairs. It was the room they broke last, because they could not break it twice, and he would like to be entirely sure he knew what was in it before he opened it. He had not broken into a room, he admitted, since 1816. He was not entirely out of practice, but he preferred to be thorough. She asked what he had been doing in 1816. Burgling a Frenchman in Vienna, he told her, as a man remarks on the weather. His country, he added, had very briefly required it. She said, slowly, that he was a spy. Her Grace, he corrected. He had been a spy for 3 years. Before that, he had been an officer. Before that, a Christ Church undergraduate. Before that, a boy. He had been, he said, an adequate version of all four, and he asked if she would care to question him further before they were interrupted. She asked him, quietly, whether he had a mother. He had already mentioned her, he pointed out. Evangeline asked anyway for her name. A look crossed his face, amused, surprised, a little wary. Her name was Cordelia Winterbourne. Dowager Duchess, 63 years old, kind, failing, easily frightened of public scandal, and not easily frightened of anything else. She did not know Lucas was here. She believed him in Scotland. When Evangeline asked what he would tell his mother, when at last he brought her home the letter, Lucas said only that he would tell her a clever woman had helped him find it. Evangeline dropped her gaze to the embroidery again. She set the needle and lifted it, set it and lifted it. She did not trust her mouth. Evangeline. Yes. The second thing I must tell you, and I tell it you because I promised I would tell you what I knew when I knew it. I found, yesterday evening, in the ledger of the back scullery account book, a line for a second tin of chamomile. The hand is your stepmother's. The line is dated the 15th of April. The 15th is in 3 days. Yes. For whom? For Mrs. Parry. He did not blink. She intends to silence her nurse on Saturday. Not for any strategic reason. I think she is simply tidying up. Mrs. Parry knew your mother. Mrs. Parry has been asking questions about the silver. Mrs. Parry is inconvenient. Evangeline's hand went still on the needle. She did not drop it. She did not gasp. She set it, with great care, down upon the linen, and folded her hands in her lap, and looked across the table at her husband. We remove her tonight. Tonight, he agreed. They did not speak of the plan in the library. Lucas went out again by the garden door. Evangeline returned to her bedroom by the servants' stair, the embroidery held before her like a shield. She passed, in the upper passage, Lady Constance's lady's maid, a sour woman called Mab, and did not meet the woman's eye. She sat on her bed and counted her breaths. 5, 4, 3, 2. Saturday. Foxglove. Mrs. Parry. 5, 4, 3. She did not weep, because weeping would have required her mouth and her lungs, and both of those were still full of the sentence, "My stepmother intends to silence my nurse on Saturday." And Evangeline could not afford to waste any part of either on grief. She could grieve on Sunday. She rose at 9:30 that evening, when the house was quiet, dressed in her oldest riding habit beneath her nightdress, so that she might shed the nightdress quickly, and sat in the window with the candle out and the curtain drawn, and waited for the signal. The signal came at 11, a low whistle, thin as a woodcock's call, from the yew walk below the window. She went down the back stair. She did not take the candle. She did not take her prayer book. She took, instead, the small pistol her father had given her on her 12th birthday, which had lived for 8 years in a false book back on the lowest shelf of her bedchamber bookcase, and which was loaded with shots small enough to blind a man and large enough to warn him. Lucas was at the yew walk. He was in plain dark clothes now, not the stable hand's rough coat. He was bareheaded. He looked at her once in the moonlight, at the pistol in her hand, at the habit beneath her cloak. "Duchess." "Do not call me that yet." "I suspect I must, in the next 4 hours, form several habits that will not flatter the pretense. Come. Mrs. Parry is at the end of the rose walk. I slipped a note under her scullery door at dusk. 3 lines, the word foxglove, and the hour of 11, and my hand. She is frightened, and she is walking slowly. Give her your hand." Evangeline went. Mrs. Parry was sitting on the low stone bench at the end of the rose walk, wrapped in a shawl and a cloak and another shawl, clutching a carpet bag, breathing unevenly. When she saw Evangeline, she rose with the slow, resolute motion of an old woman too tired to weep. "Miss Evangeline." "Nurse?" Mrs. Parry looked at her, at the dark cloak, at the pistol, at the man in the shadow of the yew, and then back to her face. "Are we running?" she said. "We are running." "Good." Mrs. Parry transferred the carpet bag to her left hand and took Evangeline's with her right. "I was hoping we might be. I have been waiting these 3 months. Lucas lifted the bag from the old woman's left hand without asking, and walked with them down the rose walk toward the dark lane beyond the hedge. A chaise waited in the lane. Lucas's own chaise, it transpired, brought up from a farm in the next parish, whose tenant Lucas had quietly paid £30 of Winterbourne coin to keep the thing ready. The horses were his. The driver was his, a silent man in a muffler, who nodded once to Lucas and did not look at Mrs. Parry or Evangeline. They drove west. The hedges closed around the lane, black ribbons against a pale moon, and the iron rims of the carriage wheels bit into the chalk ruts with a grinding hush that steadied into rhythm after the first mile. Inside, the chaise smelled of old leather and the lemon soap the tenant farmer's wife had used on the upholstery. A faint draught came through a warped window, carrying with it the damp green of April hedgerows, the sharper vegetal bite of bruised garlic mustard at the verge, the distant honeyed wet of cut hay in some field a mile off. A tawny owl crossed their path once, low and silent, a pale shape that was there and then was not. Evangeline counted the oats in the nosebag under her seat in blocks of 10 to keep from thinking of the morning. They drove, Lucas said, for the house of a magistrate he trusted, a Mr. Pelham of Reading, who had been a colonel under Lucas's father's cousin during the French wars, and who still, at 70, kept a loaded pistol in his writing desk and signed warrants with a hand that did not shake. "He will take your testimony tonight," Lucas told Mrs. Parry. "You will not have to remember it later. You will only have to remember it once. Can you?" "I can, sir." "I am not, sir." Then what, may I ask, are you? A duke, as it turns out. Ah. Mrs. Parry nodded gravely. Then I shall not be troubled by the matter, Your Grace, because a duke does not require me to approve of him, only to answer his questions. Evangeline, in the corner of the chaise, pressed her knuckles against her mouth so as not to laugh aloud. Outside the window, the April moon was pale. The hedges passed in dark ribbons. Mrs. Parry slept after the first hour, her head against Evangeline's shoulder, her hand, cold, very cold, wrapped around Evangeline's thumb like a sleeping child's. Lucas watched them both from the far corner. Evangeline thanked him, quietly, without looking at him. He observed, after a long moment, that she had not yet asked him a question. She would, he said, want to ask him why he had not told her, when he had discovered it the night before, that her stepmother had ordered the chamomile for Saturday. She had not asked it. He answered it anyway. He had wanted to move the pieces in the correct order, to have the chaise here first, the magistrate warned, the timing of the lane clear. He could have told her at 9 in the morning. He had told her at 2. He apologized, and the apology was given in the voice he had used all night, flat, careful, entirely without ornament. Evangeline looked, for the first time since the chaise had left the lane, directly at him across the dim interior. She said, evenly, that he was not to withhold a thing of that kind from her ever again, not even if he believed the withholding to be a form of protection, and she required of him that he promise it in the name he had given her in the cottage the first night. He promised. By Winterbourne, he said. And he meant the thing, in the way a man who had once held an officer's commission meant promises of that variety. Quietly, without flourish, with the flat assumption that a word once given was simply a fact of the geography. She nodded. She did not speak for a long minute. Then, because the carriage was warm, and Mrs. Parry's head was heavy against her shoulder, and because the last 3 days had hollowed her out in a way that left her feelings very close to the surface, Evangeline leaned forward, only an inch, and said, "Lucas." "Yes." "I am glad you were the stable boy." He did not answer for long enough that she thought he would not. Then, very low, without moving from his corner, "So am I, Evangeline. So am I." Mr. Pelham received them in a flannel dressing gown at 2:30 in the morning, a bottle of port on one side of the desk and a Bible on the other, and Mrs. Parry made her statement for 2 hours and a quarter. She named dates. She named dishes. She named the apothecary in Reading from whom Lady Constance had bought the foxglove under the name of a governess who did not exist. She named the coachman who had taken her late master, Evangeline's father, on his last ride home from the London house in November of 1816, and she named the doctor who had pronounced the master's heart attack, and she said, without raising her voice, "I have wondered these 10 years, sir, whether he was lost by his heart or by his cup. I am not a clever woman, but I can count." Mr. Pelham wrote in silence for a long time. When Mrs. Parry was finished, he closed the book. "Your Grace," he said to Lucas, "I have sufficient for a warrant against her ladyship's person by Monday morning. I will require the original forged letter for the forgery count proper, and for the conspiracy count against her accomplices, the coachman of 16, the apothecary at Reading. The poisoning of the nurse alone would not convict a gentlewoman in this county without another living witness. 2 witnesses make it simple." "I shall have the letter," said Lucas, "before Sunday." "Before Sunday. I give you my word." "A duke's word will do." Mr. Pelham rose. "Mrs. Parry, you will sleep in my wife's dressing room for the remainder of the night. My wife is a tolerant woman and will forgive me for it. Your Grace, I assume, will return to his stables?" "He will." "Good luck, Your Grace." "Thank you, Colonel." They drove back in the first grey light. Evangeline sat beside Lucas now, Mrs. Parry left behind, warm, safe, one of Colonel Pelham's maids already rising to make her breakfast. And neither of them spoke for the first 3 miles. Then Lucas, who had been staring out the window at the hedges, turned and looked at her, and said that he was going to kiss her once before they reached the gate, and then he was going to put her back in her bedchamber and return to the stable yard, and the kiss was going to have to last them until all of this was done. Evangeline told him she had never been kissed. "Ah," he said, and in the pale first light of the morning, his grey eyes had gone almost silver, and he said he would try to be careful. She asked him, quietly, not to be careful. He was not careful. It was brief. It was warm. It was neither sweeping nor decorous. His mouth found hers and stayed there for 4 heartbeats, long enough for her to feel the texture of his lower lip, the warmth of his breath, the faint taste of the peppermint Mr. Pelham had poured into his port, and which she had not expected. And then he drew back, slowly, as if he were memorizing her mouth the way one memorizes a street one may not walk down for years. "Put that somewhere safe, Duchess." "I shall not be able to put it anywhere at all." "Even better." The carriage turned in at the lane. He climbed out at the stable gate. He did not look back. Evangeline walked the last 100 yards to the house alone through the dawn light, the shot pistol a small weight at her pocket, her mouth still warm. The library was locked the next morning. Lady Constance had returned from Reading at midnight in a foul mood, and had required fresh tea and fresh linens and fresh grievances, and had ordered the library door locked after breakfast on the pretext that Miss Evangeline must not be permitted to exhaust herself with reading. The steward's office, however, was not locked. Mr. Grimsby had the key in a chain at his waist. Evangeline presented herself at the office door at 7, with Lucas in his stable hands coat 2 paces behind her, as the wife had been instructed to be accompanied by her menial husband at all public moments. And Mr. Grimsby, who had trained her in the Ashburn quarterly accounts when she was 15, opened the office to her without a word. "Miss Evangeline." "Mrs. Smith, now, I believe, Mr. Grimsby." "I shall not recognize that name, Miss Evangeline, if it is all one to you." "It is entirely one to me." "Very good. The older ledgers are in that chest. The letters, your father's private correspondence with his London solicitors, are in the cabinet on the left. I have been told not to open that cabinet. The key is in my desk, 2nd drawer, under the inkwell. I am about to step out to inspect the dairy. I shall be absent for precisely 40 minutes. Evangeline looked at him. He did not quite meet her gaze. "Mr. Grimsby." "Miss." "Thank you." "I have hoped, Miss Evangeline, that someone might begin to ask these questions. I am glad it is you." He stepped out. He closed the door behind him. Lucas went at once to the cabinet on the left. He had the lock open in under a minute. A twist of wire, a pressure of thumb, a soft catch. He did not speak. He had the air of a man at a task he had done many times before. He did not allow himself to be distracted by the room's contents, the late Viscount's pipes, the stuffed owl in the corner, the little watercolour of Evangeline's mother at 15 pinned above the mantel. He went to the cabinet, and opened the cabinet, and began to read. Evangeline watched his face. 4 minutes. 6. He pulled a slender bundle of folded letters from a leather folio, glanced at 2, nodded once, tied them again with their cord, and slipped them into his coat. He opened a second folder. He took 2 receipts. He closed the folio. He closed the cabinet. He locked the cabinet. He stepped back. "We have the stationer," he said, "and the first of the receipts she paid for the forgery. Now the original. The bedchamber cabinet. Yes. Tomorrow night, while she is at the assembly." "Tomorrow night." He nodded. "She will be out from 7 until midnight. Harriet will go with her. The lady's maid, Mab, will be in the servants' hall from 8 to 9, because the cook's son is returning from Oxford, and the kitchen will drink his health. That is our window. An hour, possibly 70 minutes. I will go with you." "You will?" He looked at her. "I had begun to assume you would." "Good." She shook out her skirts. "I hope you did not imagine, Your Grace, that I intended to sit in this house and embroider badly. I imagined you would embroider even worse while doing other things simultaneously. I have revised upward each morning. Try not to be charming. It undercuts my ability to pretend to be terrorized. Noted, Miss Ashburn. Mr. Grimsby was returning from his dairy inspection, which had gone well. The cows, he reported in his mild, quiet way, were thriving. Evangeline thanked him and walked out of the office with her work basket over her arm, and her husband 3 respectful paces behind her. And, in the passage, she let herself, 1 second, not 2, smile, which was a thing she had not done unattended in the house of her stepmother in a very long time. She spent the remainder of the morning, and most of the afternoon, walking around the garden with Harriet, who did not stop speaking about a new bonnet and a cousin in Bath, and a problem of the right quantity of ostrich feather, and Evangeline, who was entirely unable to think, found the uninterrupted flow of Harriet's nothing to be strangely restful. She counted dandelions. She counted the buds on the hawthorn. She counted the number of times Harriet said the phrase, "the most absolute torment," in a single sentence. 7. And did not feel the afternoon pass at all. The sun set at 7:20. The house was lit at 8. At 9 she climbed the stairs to her bedchamber, carrying a cup of chocolate she did not intend to drink, and set it, precisely, on the marble top of her washstand. She stood at the window for a long time. The moon was 3 days past full, and hung slightly lopsided above the yew. In the stable yard across the court, a small square of warm light, the candle in the crooked cottage, which she had told herself she would not look for, burned steadily through the thin linen of the cottage curtain. She watched it for 7 breaths. She told herself that she was counting her breathing because her physician had once told her that a regular breath steadied the pulse. Both of these claims were untrue. She was counting because it was the only way she could prevent herself from going downstairs and out across the courtyard and across the yard and through the cottage door. And the prevention was the part of herself, at that moment, that she most needed to keep. They danced around each other for the next 4 days, with a formality neither of them felt and both of them respected. Lucas did not come to the house. Evangeline did not go to the stables. Once, at dusk, crossing the yard to the kitchen garden on a pretext involving herbs, she saw him saddling steadfast for exercise, and did not stop. He did not stop either, but his hand paused for 1 quarter beat on the girth as she walked by, and Evangeline, who had learned to read the silences of a house, felt the quarter beat against her spine for the next hour. The assembly was at Reading. Lady Constance dressed in a puce silk she had worn 12 times previously, and a spray of garnets borrowed from a friend she had not spoken to in 5 years. Harriet wore primrose. The carriage departed at 6:15, in a quantity of fuss that required 3 servants to compose. By 7, the house was quiet. By 7:30, Mab had gone to the kitchen. By 8:20, Evangeline was at the door of Lady Constance's bedchamber, in her house slippers, a single candle in her hand, and Lucas was behind her in his boots, and neither of them was breathing loudly. The bedchamber was warm and smelled of rose-water and unwashed pillows. The walnut cabinet stood on the left wall, as Evangeline had described. Dark wood, brass-bound, a small oval lock. Lucas knelt before it. 3 minutes, he murmured. It took him 5. The lock was, he muttered once, fitted against precisely the variety of wire he had brought. Lady Constance had had it replaced, sometime in the last year, with a more competent mechanism than the original. He worked without haste. Evangeline watched the door. At 5 minutes, the lock turned. He opened the cabinet. Inside, a stack of papers tied with ribbon, a small velvet pouch, a ledger bound in red morocco. Lucas went first for the pouch, opened it, shook it into his palm, and then, softly, inhaled. Evangeline. Yes? Come here. She came. She looked. In his palm lay a gold ring, delicate, engraved with the Ashburn griffin, the inside band inscribed in a small hand, For Anne, from John, 1794. Her mother's ring. The ring Lady Constance had told her 5 Christmases ago had been lost during a move to the London house. Evangeline's throat did something she could not describe. "Keep it," she said. "Now? Put it in your pocket. I will wear it when this is over." He put it in his pocket. The next thing he took was the red ledger. He opened it. He turned 3 pages. He stopped. "The household accounts are one set," he said. "This is the other, her private." "What is in it?" "Payments." His mouth thinned. "To the coachman who drove your father in November 16, to the apothecary in Reading, to the cook who served your father's last Sunday dinner, to a midwife in Oxford who would have been paid to attend and to testify to Felicia's supposed child, had the child been necessary. She has been buying people for 10 years, Evangeline. She has been buying them with your father's silver, and when the silver ran out, she was going to buy them with your name." Evangeline could not speak. He opened the 3rd folder. He drew from it, at the bottom, a single folded sheet of paper, with a Winterbourne watermark faintly visible, and he read the first 2 lines of it, and his jaw set. The letter. The letter. He refolded it. He placed it in his inside pocket. He closed the cabinet. He relocked the lock. He rose. "We are done." "We are done." "Can you walk?" "I can walk." She could, barely. They walked together down the back passage, down the servants' stair, through the dim kitchen passage, out across the yard to the stables. Lucas took her by the arm as they reached the door of the groom's cottage, and turned her to face him. "Evangeline." "Yes." "Your stepmother will be home at midnight. She will go up to her bedchamber. She will find nothing disturbed. Tomorrow morning I will ride out with the letter and the ledger to Colonel Pelham. By tomorrow afternoon she will be under arrest. Do you understand?" "Yes." "You will be in public when it happens. I want you in public. I want 3 dozen witnesses in a room when your stepmother learns she is lost. I want no possibility of privacy or persuasion or convenient accidents. You will be at the county assembly tomorrow night. Harriet will go with you. I will arrange it." "At the assembly?" "Yes." "She intends to humiliate me there." "She does. She will announce the marriage. She will produce the village priest. She will denounce you publicly in front of everyone in the county above the rank of yeoman, and she will demand an annulment on grounds of deception. She has been planning it for a week." "I see." "And in the middle of that denunciation, Duchess, I am going to walk in wearing Winterbourne dress and a Winterbourne signet, and I am going to identify myself to the assembly, and Colonel Pelham is going to follow me with the warrant, and the constable is going to follow him." Evangeline absorbed this slowly. "You want her to begin it?" "I want her in full flight when it lands. I want her audience watching her mouth when the warrant crosses the threshold. She has spent 10 years building a reputation among these people. I want them to watch the reputation die in a single minute." "That is cruel." "It is precise." "Yes." Evangeline drew a breath. "Yes. Let it be precise." He took her hand, briefly, without ceremony, as a commander grips the hand of an officer before a charge, and released it. "Sleep, Evangeline." "I shall not sleep." "Sleep anyway. Your stepmother will be watching you tomorrow. I want her to see a terrified young bride. I cannot give you a terrified young bride if you arrive with shadows under your eyes. She will notice shadows and assume you are plotting." "I am plotting." "Yes, but she must not suspect." Evangeline nodded once. He opened the door of the main house's back passage for her, ushered her through, and closed it. She went to bed. She did not sleep, but she lay very still, with her mother's ring now hidden beneath her pillow, because he had, in the dark between the cottage and the house, slipped it there without a word. And stillness, by dawn, was something very close to rest. The Reading County Assembly Ball was held in the upper rooms of the Pelham Arms. Yes, Mr. Pelham's family had been a Reading family before they were a magistrate's family, and by 8 o'clock the floor was full of local gentry sweating through the quadrille under a crystal chandelier that had last been washed in 1817. The heat of 70 bodies rose to the plaster ceiling and condensed there in long, dim stripes between the gilded panels. Wax from the chandelier's 36 candles dripped onto the head of Sir Arthur Dewey's nephew, who had been positioned, as every year, directly beneath the most profligate of them. A footman circled periodically with a small silver shield to intercept the wax. The musicians, a first violin from Oxford, a pianist from Reading, a cellist, whose name was always announced differently in the programme, occupied a raised dais at the far end of the room, their music stands decorated with posies of primrose. The air tasted of candle grease, of a sweet young lady's orange water perfume, of the particular vegetable note of 70 people who had walked upstairs in silk stockings on a warm April evening. Lady Constance arrived in puce silk and her borrowed garnets at 8:15. Harriet wore primrose. Evangeline, by her stepmother's arrangement, wore a severe grey silk that was intended to make her look like a convalescent widow. She wore, additionally, at her wrist, the small shot pistol in a silken reticule. Lady Constance placed her at the edge of the ballroom beside the pianoforte and stepped forward into the room with the genial assurance of a woman who was about to do a good evening's work. She worked the room carefully for the first 3/4 of an hour. She greeted Lady Mornay. She spoke at length to Sir Arthur Dewey. She acknowledged the vicar's wife. She waited. Evangeline could feel her waiting, for the room to thicken with enough witnesses to make the announcement land. At 9:15, Lady Constance raised her voice slightly, not shouting, only enough. "My friends, if I might beg one moment of your indulgence." The dancers slowed. The quadrille finished in a ragged bar. The musicians, at Lady Constance's signal, laid down their instruments. "I must, with a heavy heart, announce a private matter which has become, by accident of our small society, a public one. My stepdaughter, Evangeline Ashburn, last Tuesday fortnight, married, without my consent, and in defiance of every rule of decency, a young man in my stables, a Mr. Luke Smith. He is, I believe, of Somerset. I have been, for these last 10 days, too grieved to speak of the matter. I speak of it now only because a persistent rumour, put about, I understand, by certain of my staff, has begun to suggest that this marriage was blessed and should be recognized, and that I myself—" She paused. She was a consummate performer. She let the pause stretch, was complicit. "I must, in simple defence of my own character, state plainly that the marriage was an elopement, conducted without my knowledge, that my stepdaughter has been under my roof these 10 days, not as a bride, but as a convalescent suffering from nervous exhaustion, and that the marriage, being an elopement of an heiress with a servant, is invalid by the terms of her late father's will, which forbids marriage below the station of gentleman without the trustee's consent, of which consent I am, to my sorrow, the living and only authority." The room was perfectly still. "I will not press an annulment upon her, if she will consent to withdraw from society permanently. I have a cottage in Cumbria. She may live there, privately, with an allowance of 100 a year. The matter ends there. I ask only, that no one of you extend to her, in the days and years to come, the hospitality you have, with such kindness, extended to me." Lady Constance turned, slowly, to Evangeline. "My dear," she said, "do you understand?" Evangeline stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. She had given up the habit at 13. "I understand you perfectly, stepmother," she said. "I have understood you perfectly for some years. May I speak?" "I did not invite you to—" "I shall speak." Evangeline turned to face the room. "Ladies, gentlemen, some of you knew my father. 1 or 2 of you, I believe, knew my mother. My father was Viscount Ashburn, He was taken from us in November 1816 on the Oxford Road in his own carriage, the 7th day after he first complained to Mrs. Parry, our nurse, of a pain in his left arm and a strange taste in his morning chocolate. My stepmother had been married to him 3.5 years. Lady Constance said sharply, "You will not!" "I shall." Mrs. Parry is at this moment in the house of Colonel Pelham, the magistrate, whose home many of you know. She gave a statement to the colonel at 3 in the morning on the 13th of this month. In that statement, she testified that the cook serving my father his last meals was paid by my stepmother the sum of £12 on the 8th of November and the sum of £8 on the 15th. £12, ladies, is a great deal of money for a cook. The cook in question left this country for Ireland on the 23rd of November of that year and has not since returned. A murmur, small, uncertain, began in the back of the room. In the 9 years since my father's death, my stepmother has sold the following from this house: the Ashburn silver, the second Van Dyck portrait, my grandmother's pearls, my mother's pianoforte, which many of you admired at the breakfasts my father used to give, and the grey mare my father brought home for me in 1812, which he had paid for personally, and which was entered in the estate book under my personal name, and not under the estate's. She has, additionally, in the last 9 months, attempted to extort £30,000 from the Dowager Duchess of Winterbourne by means of a forged letter which I have in my possession tonight. And she has, in the last month, attempted to poison me, slowly, with an infusion of foxglove in my morning tea. I have the tin. Colonel Pelham has my testimony, and that of Mrs. Parry. Lady Constance had turned, slowly, visibly, a colour very close to the puce of her dress. "This is," she began. This is a demented girl, ladies and gentlemen, who has—" "No," Evangeline looked at her. "This is the daughter of John Ashburn, and I would like, before I go any further, to introduce to you the gentleman I married on the 3rd of April in our family chapel, before the eyes of a priest and of my cousin Harriet, and whose name my stepmother intended, tonight, to use against me." She did not turn. She did not need to. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. Lucas walked through them. He was not in a stable lad's coat. He was in a blue evening coat of extraordinary fit, white breeches, a white neckcloth tied with a precision Evangeline had not been permitted to witness until this moment, and boots that had been polished by a valet. He wore at his throat the Winterbourne diamond, a stone the size of a robin's egg set in silver, which had been worn to every coronation since 1714. He wore, on the smallest finger of his left hand, the Winterbourne signet. He walked up the length of the ballroom. He did not hurry. He did not look at Lady Constance. He stopped in front of Evangeline. He bowed to her, a full, formal bow, deep, unhurried, and offered her his hand. "Your Grace." "Your Grace." He straightened. He turned, at last, to the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am Lucas Edmund Winterbourne, 10th Duke of Winterbourne. I married Miss Evangeline Ashburn in her family chapel on the 3rd of April, under a license, the drafting of which was paid for, with some difficulty, by her stepmother. I did so in the name of Luke Smith, because, at the time, I was employed as a stable hand in Lady Constance Ashburn's household, investigating a series of crimes which, thanks to my wife's cooperation and Colonel Pelham's patience, have now been fully established. Colonel Pelham is in the doorway behind me. The constables of Reading are in the passage behind him. Lady Constance Ashburn, madam, you are under warrant for the poisoning of Viscount Ashburn in 1816, the attempted poisoning of Miss Mary Parry on the 15th of April of this year, and the forgery of the Winterbourne letter. I suggest that you cooperate. The room is full, and you would not enjoy the further indignity of a chase." Lady Constance drew breath to answer. She did not. Colonel Pelham, the magistrate, appeared at the far doorway in a dark coat, cleared his throat, and began to walk down the line of the ballroom with the measured pace of a man who had arrested more competent criminals than this one, and would arrest more after her. Lady Constance sank, white-faced and stiff-spined, into a chair that Sir Arthur Dewey, without looking at her, pushed forward with his foot. Harriet Ashburn fainted on the primrose satin. No one caught her. She landed softly. The constables took Lady Constance out by the side door at 9:47, according to the clock above the orchestra, which Evangeline watched with a fixity she did not know she possessed. When the door had closed, there was a silence of perhaps 3 breaths. Then Sir Arthur Dewey, who had known Evangeline's father, turned to the orchestra and said in a voice of unruffled command, "A waltz, please." The musicians, dazed, obedient, lifted their instruments. Lucas, who had not let go of Evangeline's hand, now offered her his arm. "Your Grace. Your Grace." They walked out onto the floor. He danced, Evangeline discovered, exactly as he did everything else. With competence, without flourish, and with a focus upon his partner that made the rest of the room irrelevant. His hand was steady at her waist. His other hand cradled hers as carefully as if her bones were made of the crystal of the chandelier. Halfway through the second circuit he murmured, against her temple, "If you faint, Duchess, I shall be very disappointed." "I have no intention of fainting. Harriet has claimed the privilege for us both." "I noticed. I shall remember her sacrifice." "Lucas." "Yes?" "I have not thanked you." "Nor should you. You owe me no thanks for removing a murderess from your breakfast table. You owe me a great many discussions about the next chapter, which may be more difficult to negotiate than this chapter has been." "Difficult?" "I live in Wiltshire. My house contains, among other inconveniences, an aged mother, a library of 32,000 volumes, a staff of 60, a steward whose disapproval of me is expressed daily in the shape of his eyebrow, and a kitchen cat who will reject you for 6 weeks before forgiving you. You will find it all extremely inconvenient, and you will, I hope, run every part of it exactly as you please. I do not yet know how to run a duchy. No one does. One learns by running it badly and gradually less badly. I learned for 4 years. You may have a month or 2 on me." She laughed against his shoulder, in the middle of the waltz. The chandelier, the watching ladies, the departed stepmother, all of it receded to a soft hum. "I shall want to read your library." "I assumed you would. I have prepared a chair with a very good lamp." "I shall want Mrs. Parry installed in the housekeeper's wing." "Already arranged." "I shall want Steadfast in the east paddock." "I've had the paddock fenced since January." She pulled back a fraction to look at him. "Since January?" "I have been, Evangeline, cautiously optimistic since January." The waltz turned. He brought her close again. His breath was warm at her ear, and at 10:15, on the 17th of April, in the upper assembly rooms of the Pelham Arms in Reading, the new Duchess of Winterbourne said something against her husband's shoulder that no one in the room could hear, and the Duke, after a considered pause, in the middle of the floor, in front of 62 witnesses, lowered his head and kissed her, precisely, and once, on the temple, like a signature. They did not go back to the Ashburn house that night. Lucas had taken rooms at the Pelham Arms, 2 suites joined by a private sitting room, because the Duke of Winterbourne could not afford to be seen to occupy his wife's room in public before the society that had, 3 hours previously, believed her an impostor. Propriety had to be performed for 6 weeks at least. Then it could be returned to the attic, in which the Duke habitually kept it. Evangeline sat in the sitting room in her grey silk, her hair half down, her slippers off, her feet drawn beneath her on a silk-covered settee, and drank a small glass of brandy Lucas had poured for her without asking. The fire had been laid an hour earlier by a chambermaid who had curtsied 5 times on her way out of the room. The coals had settled now into a deep red glow, and the copper bed warmer by the hearth caught the firelight like a second, smaller sun. A single lamp on the card table threw a circle of amber onto the blue wool of the carpet. The sash of the window had been left open a hand's breadth. Through it came the small, cool sound of the April town. A carriage on the high street, a dog under a stable door, a church bell chiming midnight, with the particular slow dignity of a country town going to bed. She said, experimentally, that she was a duchess. Lucas agreed she was. She said she did not yet know how to sign her new name. He told her she would practice. His mother would teach her, and his mother had 13 variations of the signature and a favorite for each day of the week. Evangeline lifted her glass and turned the firelight inside it. She said, slowly, that she had not thought about a mother-in-law in any practical sense. Lucas told her that his mother would adore her, that he had been writing to the Dowager since the 14th of February, that the Rose Suite on the second floor had been under preparation since the 17th, and that his mother would certainly cry when she met her, because it was his mother's habit, and Evangeline was not to be alarmed by it. Evangeline turned the brandy glass in her fingers. She said his name. He waited. She reminded him, quietly, without looking up, of the promise he had made in the cottage on the first night, when he had said he would not touch her until she asked. He said he remembered. She asked if he had meant it. He said he had meant it. She asked if he still did. Every hour of every day since, Evangeline. You have only ever had to ask. She set the glass down on the small table beside the settee. I am asking, she said. He crossed the sitting room in 3 strides, knelt on the floor before the settee, for the second time in their marriage, for the second time in her life, and took her face between his hands. His thumbs grazed the line of her jaw with the same careful attention he had once used to test her pulse. He did not kiss her yet. He looked at her as a man who had waited a great distance for a thing and was determined not to hurry the arrival. Her name, when he said it, came out quietly. He asked her to say it again, and she did. She asked him, please, Your Grace, to touch her. I love you. His voice was low, very low and quite steady. I ought to have said it 11 days ago in the carriage. I ought to have said it 3 days ago in Colonel Pelham's drawing room. I ought to have said it tonight, on the floor of the assembly in the middle of the waltz. I was waiting for you to be free. You are free. I love you. She told him then that she loved him too. He began to say something else, the conditional form of a husband's warning, the old cavalry officer's voice resurfacing in his throat, and she cut him off with her own terms, set out plainly, in the manner of a steel rose drawing up the treaty of a peace she intended to keep. If she ever changed her mind, she would inform him. If he ever withheld the truth from her again, she would poison his tea. The rules of the marriage were simple, and they would not become complicated. Noted, Duchess. He kissed her. Not once, not briefly, not carefully, with, at last, the full weight of every week in which he had not permitted himself to kiss her at all. Her hands found the back of his neck. The brandy glass, untended on the small table, caught the firelight and threw it across the wall in a slow amber stripe. After a long time, a very long time, she found her mouth again. She said his name into the hollow of his shoulder, and, when he made a small, inquiring sound against her temple, she told him, quietly, that she did not know how to be a duchess. He drew back at that. His hand was warm against her cheek. His voice had, she noticed for the first time, gone, at the edges, slightly rough. She had been being a duchess for 11 days, he told her. She had been being a duchess since she was 13. She counted her breaths when she was afraid. She refused to lower her voice and refused to raise it. She embroidered badly on purpose and rescued old women from murderers in her nightdress. She was, he said, in every bone of her body, the Duchess of Winterbourne. The name caught up. It always did. It had taken him 4 years. She would take 5 minutes, because she was cleverer than he was, and had always been. He asked her then, very plainly, to come to bed. She came. 6 months later, on a morning of late autumn, when the beech leaves in the Winterbourne Park had gone the colour of her wedding ring gold, and the first frost was on the stable yard cobbles, Evangeline stood at the kitchen door of the restored Ashburn house in working dress and muddy boots, watching Mrs. Parry take a loaf from the oven. The kitchen had been, 6 months ago, a cold grey room with a tin kettle and a single unlit range. It was now a warm yellow room with 2 ranges, a copper pan rail, a proper salt box, and a wooden rack above the dresser on which 12 of Mrs. Parry's loaves cooled each morning for the estate workers. The flagstones had been relaid. The great beam across the ceiling, oak, blackened, sagging in March, had been jacked up by a cheerful pair of carpenters in June, and now ran level, hung with drying bundles of rosemary and sage and thyme. 3 whitewashed walls had become 4 whitewashed walls. A window that had been boarded over for 5 years had, on a warm morning in July, been reopened to the kitchen garden. Light fell now through diamond-paned glass onto the scrubbed pine table in a pattern that shifted with the wind in the apple tree outside. The apple tree was bare this morning. Its small, hard fruit had been gathered 10 days earlier and now filled 3 barrels in the cellar. A robin worked the frost-softened earth at its roots. The kitchen smelled of warm bread and the lavender Mrs. Parry kept in a green stoneware jar on the dresser because, she said, a kitchen without lavender was not a kitchen, merely a room in which one happened to cook.
That is an astonishingly competent loaf, nurse.
It ought to be. I've been making loaves in this kitchen since 1796. It would be a disgrace to the institution if I had not, in 30 years, learned. You are in a very good temper this morning. I am. I shall be in a poorer temper after luncheon, when your husband will no doubt wish to discuss Italian drainage again. He wishes to discuss drainage everywhere. It is his favourite subject, after horses. Yes. Mrs. Parry set the loaf on the board. I have noticed, Your Grace, that he is happiest in low boots and in a stable. One would not expect it of a duke, but one would expect it of you. I take comfort in the match. Evangeline smiled. She did not answer. She took down the chamomile tin from the shelf, a tin that now contained nothing but chamomile, because the foxglove tin had been surrendered as evidence at the July assize, and measured out 2 spoons into the pot. 2 cups. 2 cups. You will be in from the paddock shortly, then? I expect so. He was. She heard his boots on the yard stone before she saw him. She did not turn. She was, she realized, counting. Not from 5 backward, which she had given up in April, but from 1 forward, which was a habit she was still learning, and which suited her much better. Evangeline. Lucas. He came in through the kitchen door, mud on his boots, the smell of the stables on his coat. His grey eyes caught the kitchen light. His hand, the one she had memorized 11 days into their marriage, and had not since stopped memorizing, closed around her waist as he passed, light as a reminder. Steadfast, fold. She did not. She did. Colt. Dark brown, a white blaze. She is a grey, and the colt is brown, and the groom is shocked. I am not shocked. His sire was a bay. When? 40 minutes ago. I came to fetch you. Mrs. Parry, may we steal the loaf, or will you pursue us with a wooden spoon? I shall pursue you only as far as the threshold, Your Grace. Take the loaf, take your wife, leave me the kettle. They took the loaf. They walked out through the back door and across the yard, past the low window of the crooked cottage that had once been a groom's and was now, by Evangeline's order, a small dry room for storing tack, and into the warm darkness of the stable, where Steadfast, 12 years old and entirely pleased with herself, stood over a small brown creature, folded like a wet umbrella on the straw. Evangeline knelt. The colt lifted a drenched, astonished head. Hello, she said. Lucas knelt beside her. His shoulder brushed hers. The loaf of bread sat in a stable-yard mucking fork bucket between them,
because they had both forgotten they were holding it, and neither had remembered where to put it. "Well, Duchess?"
"Well, Your Grace."
"What shall we call him?"
She considered. She looked at the cot, and then at her husband, at the grey, steady eyes, at the calloused thumb resting light on the stall rail, at the man who had once rubbed down her mare in shirt-sleeves and said, without surprise, "Miss Ashburn." And she thought of a cottage in April, and a candle on a chest, and a single whispered word. "Grace," she said. Lucas laughed, quietly in his chest, a laugh she had heard 6 times now, and was in no hurry to stop hearing, and did not, for once, have the last word. If this story kept you company to the end, leave me one line in the comments, just the moment you exhaled, the moment you knew she'd be all right. I read every one of them, and if you'd like to stay for the next fire, the next cottage, the next Duchess, the bell below is warm, and I'll light another candle on Friday. Good night, friends.